They buried you in silence, pain, and betrayal, but you rose with focus, fire, and a blueprint they'll never decode. Hello, you were counted out, laughed at behind closed doors, written off like you were nothing. They thought the pain would destroy you, they thought the silence would break you, but what they didn't say was the storm building inside you. This is not just a comeback, this is your rise from the ashes. Because the ones who buried you are about to witness the fire they started. They thought you were finished until you came back stronger. They celebrated your downfall too early. The moment you slipped, they smiled. The moment you stumbled, they whispered, not out of concern, but out of comfort, because your fall gave them peace. It validated their own stagnation. It made them feel taller without ever having to climb. They didn't offer a hand, they didn't ask if you were okay, they just watched and waited, like vultures circling what they thought was a corpse. But what they failed to realize, what they never understood, is that your downfall wasn't a death sentence. It was a transformation. It was the cracking of a shell, not the collapse of a soul. They mistook the chaos of your silence for the end of your fire, but you weren't finished, you were forming. See, they loved the version of you that was easy to manage. The one that still sought approval, the one that still played small to fit in, the one who gave more than they got. But the second you started losing, the masks came off. The ones who claimed to care disappeared. The ones who clapped when you were winning turned their backs. They didn't just walk away. They mocked you on the way out. They used your pain as punchlines. They spoke your name like it was a warning instead of a memory. But here's the thing they never calculated. You were never afraid of falling. You were afraid of never flying, and falling was the price of growth. They thought it was over when it was really just beginning. Because sometimes rock bottom isn't the end, it's the forge, the place where fire meets pressure, the place where weakness burns off and what's left is unstoppable. They couldn't see what was happening in the quiet. In the late nights when you had nothing but your thoughts and your rage, when you were rethinking every choice, every sacrifice, every betrayal, they didn't see the nights you broke and rebuilt, the mornings you got up with nothing left but spite in your chest and steel in your spine. They didn't see the small wins, the silent discipline, the painful consistency, because they weren't looking. They were busy celebrating a version of your life that no longer existed. They thought they were watching your ending, but what they were actually watching was a reset. The problem is, they got comfortable with the version of you that didn't know who you were yet, the version that tolerated too much, gave too much, trusted too fast, loved too deep. But once the fall happened, everything changed. You saw them for who they were, and more importantly, you saw yourself for who you could become. Pain has a way of sharpening your vision, of burning off illusions. What's left is clarity. They cheered when you were at your lowest because it made them feel safe. You were no longer a threat, no longer a reminder of what they weren't willing to become. But the moment you started moving again, the moment you started breathing fire again, the fear returned, because now you weren't coming back to what you were. You were coming back stronger, quieter, smarter, colder, and that terrified them. They thought your silence meant defeat. They didn't realize you were loading. Preparing, watching, while they were laughing, you were plotting. While they were gossiping, you were grinding. You weren't trying to prove them wrong. You were just trying to prove to yourself that nothing could kill you, not even them. They had a funeral in their minds for who you used to be, but you didn't die. You evolved. They just don't recognize the version of you that walked out of the fire, and they shouldn't, because that version is gone. What stands now is something else, something forged, something earned. You didn't come back for revenge. You came back for redemption, for truth, for power, for peace, and none of them can take credit for that. Not one of them can say they helped you build this, they helped destroy you, and that was their role. Their chapter ended when they celebrated too early. The rest of the story, that's yours now. They thought it was over. But you were just getting started. They mistook silence for surrender. They thought you disappeared because you gave up. They assumed the absence of noise meant the absence of fight, that your quiet meant weakness. That you had nothing left to say, nothing left to give, nothing left to become, but they were wrong. They didn't understand that silence isn't always the sound of defeat. It's often the sound of transformation. The silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. You weren't gone, you were present in the shadows, you were watching, studying, rebuilding, healing. You were sitting with your pain instead of running from it. You were asking the hard questions. You were facing the truth that most people spend their whole lives trying to avoid. You weren't broken. You were becoming precise. You weren't lost. You were learning to navigate without their validation. You weren't done. You were dangerous, because silence is not the absence of power. It's the gathering of it. They mocked your stillness because they couldn't comprehend it, because they only understand noise. The loudest one in the room, the show-off, the desperate reach for attention. But while they were busy performing, you were becoming. While they screamed for recognition, you built in secrecy. Your silence made them uncomfortable because it reminded them how loud their insecurity was. Your stillness made them nervous because it hinted at something they couldn't predict, control. They couldn't see the early mornings where you rose in the dark, not to be seen, but to be sharp. They didn't hear the war going on in your chest, the one where you chose discipline over comfort, self-respect over approval, purpose over popularity. They didn't see what it took to stay quiet while they dragged your name. They didn't feel the restraint it took not to respond when every part of you wanted to defend your worth, but you didn't explain, you didn't beg, you didn't argue, you just moved in silence, because lions don't roar when they stalk. They wait, they lock in, and then they strike. They underestimated what happens when someone stops talking and starts executing. They thought they had silenced you, but really you silenced them. You chose not to respond, not because you were weak, but because you knew your actions would speak louder than their opinions ever could, and now they see it, now they feel it, now they wonder how you went from invisible to undeniable without ever announcing it. Because real power doesn't make noise, it makes impact. You weren't silent because you were lost. You were silent because you had finally found something worth protecting, yourself. You were tired of wasting energy proving your value to people who were committed to misunderstanding you. You realized that every time you explained yourself to those who never intended to listen, you were giving away parts of your soul, and so you stopped talking, not because you had nothing to say, but because they were no longer worth the words. And in that silence you remembered who you were, you remembered why you started, you remembered how it felt before they filled your head with doubt, before the betrayals, before the setbacks. You returned to the truth that didn't need to be spoken, it just needed to be lived. That's the kind of silence that changes people, the kind that turns pain into precision, confusion into clarity, weakness into weaponry. Now they look at you and they don't recognize what you've become. And they shouldn't, because what came out of that silence was not the same version that fell into it. What came out was sharper, calmer, colder, not numb, just focused, not heartless, just done explaining your value to the blind. Now your silence speaks volumes, it intimidates, it commands, it says everything that words could never say. They thought your silence was an ending, but it was only the reset, the recalibration, the moment you chose to stop reacting and start building. And now that you've returned, you don't owe them noise, you don't owe them words, you don't owe them anything. Let them wonder what happened in the dark, because if they couldn't hear your silence, they'll never survive your voice. Pain was the fuel, not the finish. You weren't built in peace, you were built in pressure, in betrayal, in abandonment, in the long nights where no one checked in and no one cared if you made it out. That pain, they thought it would break you, they thought it would bury you, they thought it would be the end of your story, but pain didn't finish you, it started you, it introduced you to the version of yourself you would have never met in comfort. The worst moments of your life became the foundation of your strength, not because you wanted them, not because you deserved them, but because you survived them. You didn't just walk through fire, you learned how to live in it. You didn't just take the hits, you used them to sharpen your edge. That pain, they tried to use it against you, tried to humiliate you with it, tried to remind you of it like a weapon, but you took it back. You claimed it, and now it burns for you, not against you. You stopped asking why. You stopped needing closure. You stopped hoping for apologies that were never coming. You looked pain in the face and said, "Let's go to work." Because at some point you realized no one was going to save you. That the world doesn't stop for your wounds, that no one truly understands the weight you carry. So you stopped explaining and started carrying it anyway. You stopped using pain as a reason to quit, and started using it as proof you were never meant to. Pain became the reminder that you didn't die when they left, that you didn't collapse when it all fell apart, that you didn't break when life ripped your plans to pieces. You felt it all, you bled, you cried. You screamed behind closed doors, and then you stood back up because the pain didn't weaken you, it refined you, it peeled back the soft layers and revealed what was real, it stripped you of illusions, of weakness, of dependency. It didn't take from you, it revealed you. They thought the pain would silence you, they thought it would paralyze you, but it became the reason you got louder, the reason you went harder. The reason you cut off the dead weight and kept moving, because once you learn how to use pain, it becomes power, not the loud kind, not the kind that screams for attention, but the kind that moves differently, with purpose, with intention, with edge. They don't know what it cost you to smile again. They don't know how many nights you had to remind yourself to breathe, how many mornings you didn't want to rise but did anyway. They see the strength now, but they'll never know the suffering that built it. That's fine. They don't have to. Let them think you were always this composed, this sharp, this focused. They don't need to see the pain. They just need to feel the result, because pain didn't finish you. It educated you. It taught you who was real and who was using you. It showed you who stayed when everything crumbled and who vanished. It made you trust yourself more than any voice in the crowd. It taught you how to walk alone and still move like an army. And now that pain sits behind your eyes. It sharpens your vision. It drives your discipline. It protects your peace. They wanted the pain to make you bitter, to make you small, to make you give up. But all it did was wake you up. And now that you're awake, really awake, there's no going back. You've tasted resilience. You felt what it means to crawl when your legs gave out and fight when your soul was exhausted. That kind of experience rewires you. You stop asking for fairness. You start demanding results. You stop looking for comfort. You start hunting for purpose. You didn't ask for the pain, but now you own it. It's yours, not a scar to hide, but a torch to carry. Every time they see you, they're not looking at a survivor. They're looking at a weapon. Forged in fire, sharpened by experience, carried by pain, you turned every wound into wisdom, every tear into armor, every failure into fuel. You never needed a soft road. You needed a reason, and pain gave it to you. So now, when they look at you and wonder how you did it, how you stayed standing when everything tried to crush you, don't say a word. Just let them feel the heat of everything that tried to burn you down. Still burning behind your eyes, you turned betrayal into blueprint. You took what was meant to destroy you and built with it. They thought betraying you would break you, that it would leave you bitter, frozen, stuck in a cycle of pain and confusion. But instead you studied it. You studied the lies, the silence, the fake apologies, the quiet exits. You didn't just survive betrayal. You dissected it. You broke it down to its roots, pulled the emotions apart, and turned every piece into something useful. It hurt, no question, but you didn't let that pain go to waste, because betrayal exposes. It exposes people for who they are, and it exposes you for what you've been tolerating. You saw it up close, people who said they loved you, people who smiled in your face while sharpening the knife. The ones who clapped when you were winning, then vanished when you needed help. The ones who used your loyalty as leverage. The ones who knew your wounds and still pressed down harder. It's a hard thing to swallow, watching someone you trusted trade your name for comfort. Watching someone you would have gone to war for walk away like you never existed, but the moment you stopped taking it personally, everything changed, because betrayal isn't about you, it's about them. It reflects who they are, not what you lacked. And once you saw that, once you faced the truth, you stopped bleeding for people who wouldn't even hand you a bandage. You stopped explaining yourself, you stopped overgiving, you started observing quietly, ruthlessly, and with every betrayal the blueprint became clearer. You began building boundaries where there were none. You stopped allowing access without effort. You stopped letting loyalty be a free pass. You learned how to watch what people do when you have nothing to offer them, how they speak about you when you're not around, how quickly they switch sides when things go wrong. You stopped giving your energy to convenience-based loyalty. Because betrayal taught you that presence doesn't equal support, that history doesn't equal honor, and that not everyone who stands beside you is rooting for you. So you moved different, you got smarter. You learned how to keep your heart open but your eyes sharper. You learned that love without awareness is self-sabotage, that forgiveness doesn't mean re-entry, that empathy doesn't mean access. You became selective, not bitter. Reserved, not cold, and that shift, that quiet shift, turned your setbacks into systems. You didn't just grow from betrayal, you built around it. Now your life runs differently. You don't chase anymore. You don't beg anymore. You let people reveal themselves and you believe them the first time. You don't force connections. You don't argue with disrespect. You move, and you move with a memory, clear, collected, powerful. You don't hate anyone. You don't seek revenge. You don't need to. The best revenge was reconstruction. The best closure was no contact. The best response was showing up every day and building something so solid, so undeniable, that the ones who betrayed you have to watch from a distance. They gave you the blueprint without knowing it. Every lie showed you where your standards were too low. Every abandonment showed you where your value wasn't being honored. Every silence showed you who never truly listened. And in their betrayal you found your alignment. You stopped confusing attachment with connection. You stopped equating consistency with loyalty. You stopped trusting words more than actions. You finally got honest with them and with yourself. So now you build different. You build with intention, with clarity, with a heart that's been tested and a mind that's been sharpened. You don't rush to trust. But when you do, it's real. You don't overshare. But when you speak, it's felt. You don't need crowds, but when you show up, your presence is unmatched. That's the blueprint betrayal gave you, not to be bitter, but to be better, not to shut down, but to level up, not to become someone new, but to return to who you were before the world taught you to shrink. They thought betraying you would ruin you, that you'd crumble under the weight of confusion, anger, and grief. But you didn't. You slowed down, you got still, you read the pattern, and now you move with precision. They tried to break you, but all they did was hand you the blueprint for never needing them again. So let them watch you build with the bricks they threw. You never needed them to be loyal. You just needed them to reveal themselves. You outgrew the grave they dug. They thought they were burying you, thought the weight they threw on your name, your spirit, your future, was enough to keep you down permanently. They whispered about you like you were gone. Moved on like you never mattered, watched the dirt fall on your back and smiled, thinking they'd finally silence the part of you that made them uncomfortable, that confident part, that driven part, that light they could never replicate. They didn't want to compete with you, so they tried to kill you in silence. But what they didn't understand is that you weren't dead. You were planted. You were placed in isolation, in darkness, under pressure, not to rot, but to rise. They saw a grave, you saw soil, they saw an ending, you found a beginning, because some growth happens in front of the world, but the most powerful transformations happen underground, where no one claps. Where no one notices, where the work is silent but the result is undeniable. You didn't just survive that season, you grew past it. They expected you to stay stuck, to stay small. They expected you to spend the rest of your life explaining the moment you broke. But you didn't break. You shifted, you evolved, you went deeper. You didn't beg for a way out. You started building your way up. Every time they doubted you, you laid another layer of discipline. Every time they mocked you, you added another inch of resilience. Every time they tried to bury your purpose under their opinions, you remembered who you were before the world tried to mold you. The dirt they used to cover you became your foundation. You didn't need a rescue. You needed resistance. You didn't need their approval. You needed their absence to remember your direction. They wanted you to suffocate under the weight of rejection, but instead, you learned how to breathe under pressure. You grew roots in pain, you got grounded in silence, you let the dark teach you what the light never could. That grave wasn't your ending, it was your recalibration. You stopped trying to prove anything to anyone. You stopped trying to earn worth from people who never saw you clearly to begin with. You stopped begging for love where only ego lived, and once you stopped needing their recognition, you started moving different. You moved with focus, with patience, with fire, quiet fire, the kind that doesn't burn down bridges, it builds new paths. They tried to write you off, tried to box you in, tried to make your downfall your identity. But you didn't let them define you by a chapter they couldn't finish. You closed the book on their version of your story and picked up the pen for yourself. They tried to define you by your lowest moment, but you made that moment your launch point. You didn't deny the pain, you used it, you sat with it, you let it shape you, not shrink you, because real growth doesn't mean pretending the betrayal didn't hurt or the failure didn't cut deep. It means rising anyway, bleeding and still building, crying and still continuing, being counted out and still showing up. Now they look at you and don't know how to process what you've become. They only knew the version of you that still sought approval. Still wanted to be chosen, still thought loyalty could save relationships that were already dead. But this new version, this one grew in the grave, this one doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't entertain energy that doesn't match peace. This version doesn't scream to be seen. It moves in silence and makes impact impossible to ignore. The grave they dug became your garden. You bloomed in the very place they left you for dead. You outgrew their expectations. Outgrew their gossip, outgrew their shallow support, and you did it without needing revenge, without needing validation. You didn't have to prove them wrong. You just had to become right within yourself. And that's exactly what you did. So now when they see you walking tall, clear-eyed, unshaken, they'll feel the mistake they made, not because you forced them to, but because your presence now echoes in the silence they left behind. You outgrew the grave, and now you're standing where they hoped you'd never rise. You became everything they feared, not because you set out to intimidate them, not because you changed who you were just to get back at them. No, it happened because you finally stopped shrinking. You stopped making yourself small to make them feel secure. You stopped apologizing for your ambition, your clarity, your fire. You stopped explaining yourself to people who never really listened, who only ever tolerated the softer version of you, the one they thought they could control. They weren't afraid of your failure. That's what they were hoping for. That's what they celebrated behind fake smiles and hollow support. They weren't afraid of your struggle. They used to feed off it. They felt safe when you were second, guessing yourself when you were hesitating. When you were stuck in the loop of overthinking, overpleasing, overtrusting, but when you cut through that noise, when you made the choice to walk forward anyway, to face the consequences of growth, to stop holding back, they started to panic. They were never scared of your mistakes. They were scared of your momentum, of what would happen if you healed, if you focused, if you stopped giving your time to empty people and dead conversations. If you let go of the need to be liked. They were afraid of what would happen if you stopped looking for permission and started giving yourself direction. And that's exactly what you did, slowly, silently, relentlessly. You started doing the work that no one clapped for. You started showing up when no one noticed. You started rebuilding without needing anyone to believe in you. They didn't see the early mornings, the internal battles, the nights where you sat with your disappointment and refused to let it define you, but they feel it now. They feel the shift, the confidence in your voice, the steadiness in your eyes, the way you carry yourself without flinching. You became a version of yourself that doesn't beg to be understood, that doesn't water yourself down to keep peace, that doesn't pretend to be okay with mediocrity just to keep a seat at someone else's table. You built your own. You stopped showing up out of habit and started showing up with purpose. You stopped pouring into people who only ever poked holes in you, and that scared them, not because you became cruel, but because you became clear. They thrived when you were uncertain, when you were emotionally accessible to anyone with a smile, when you mistook manipulation for love and silence for respect. But when you saw through the masks, when you started protecting your energy like it mattered, everything changed. You didn't have to announce it. You didn't have to explain. You just moved, and your movement made them uncomfortable. Now you walk with a stillness they can't disrupt, a focus they can't distract, a strength that doesn't need to yell. You became grounded, intentional, unshakable, and to people who are only ever invested in your confusion, your clarity is terrifying. They were never ready for this version of you, the one that sets boundaries without guilt. The one that doesn't chase conversations that feel forced, the one that doesn't seek closure from the same hands that caused the wound. You stopped reaching back to what already let you go. You stopped mourning doors that were never meant to stay open. And that's when everything shifted. You became their fear, not because you did anything to them, but because you became whole without them. You became disciplined. You became powerful in your restraint. You chose silence over drama, self-control over reaction, growth over gossip, and the more you stepped into that version of yourself, the more their masks began to slip. They weren't clapping for you, they were watching you, waiting for the moment you'd slip back into the old patterns. But that version of you, it's gone, and it's never coming back. You became everything they feared, because you became free. Free from needing to be accepted by people who never accepted themselves. Free from emotional games, free from cycles that only led to the same kind of pain. You stepped outside the cage they tried to keep you in, and now every step you take away from their version of your life is a step toward everything they tried to convince you you'd never be. You didn't change to hurt them. You changed to save yourself, and they can't stand the fact that you did. They thought it was over. They thought the silence meant defeat. They mistook your stillness for surrender. They didn't realize you were just recalculating, not retreating. They celebrated too early because what they buried wasn't your end. It was your rebirth. You turned betrayal into strategy. You used pain as fuel. You studied the darkness, endured the weight, and you rose not bitter, not broken, but reborn in clarity and conviction. They feared this version of you, the one that doesn't flinch, the one that doesn't beg, the one that moves in silence and strikes in truth. You didn't just survive, you evolved, so let them keep watching, let them whisper, doubt, and wonder, because what's coming now is something they'll never be able to stop, control, or even understand. You were never finished. You were just getting started, and now you're stronger than ever. Goodbye to the old you, and goodbye to anyone who tried to bury what they couldn't kill.